Beast stares out of a window at the Xavier Institute and doesn't feel happy about what he sees. Cyclops, who is standing beside him, isn't shocked, because they both see a sentinel just floating above the yard. None of the team is happy about it. However, Hank wasn't talking about that, though he has to admit that the thought of being watched by government machines like sentinels doesn't make him feel good either. Scott wants to understand what Hank is discussing. Hank was talking about energy. He explains that all living things, like plants, insects, animals, humans, and mutants, have been found to be connected to energy at their most fundamental levels. Hank also adds that every study indicates that genetic mutants possess distinct and more potent energy signatures. Scott doesn't understand the significance of this. Hank asks Scott to think it through. Just last week, there were more than 1 million mutants all around the world, and now, almost all of them seem to be indistinguishable from humans. Therefore, as a scientist, Beast is merely curious about where all that energy has vanished. In the depths of outer space, a crimson energy envelops a section of the Earth. The spaceship called Prospect has been completely destroyed, and the team at Mission Control attempts to communicate with the astronauts. Tragically, everyone has died. 2 people are still in the spaceship's front, while another is spacewalking, with his face shield shattered. Mission Control grows increasingly concerned, because they haven't heard from the astronauts in 3 days. However, none of the astronauts are able to respond. As communication shuts down, a space rock full of energy is rushing toward the spaceship, striking one of the astronauts. The man rises to his feet, and now, the energy floats all around his body. He stands up, realizing that he can't be the only one affected. He moves over to another astronaut and observes that the person's face has been completely destroyed. The man, Peterson, gently touches the injured astronaut, and at that precise moment, a radiant green light suddenly appears. Mission Control listens in on the man's conversation and demands an explanation of what's happening. But then, everything goes crazy, and everyone begins to scream. The man's eyes shine with pride. He returns to the spacecraft, where he learns that the mission was for space exploration. Overwhelmed by the revelation that he's in the 21st century, the man angrily shouts and releases a burst of energy. At the Xavier Institute, Nightcrawler looks at an old photograph from his early days when he first joined the second team of X-Men. Colossus notices and playfully remarks that Kurt must be remembering. Kurt acknowledges that he can't help but feel nostalgic, considering how much has transformed since those early times. It just struck him that this might be one of the rare occasions when they've all gathered together again since that era. At least those who are still alive. Peter tells Kurt that they shouldn't jump to conclusions about the professor being gone. They walk away together, and Kurt certainly hopes that's the case, but can't understand why they haven't confirmed it. Peter is confident that they will eventually locate Xavier. Kurt asks Peter if he remembers the feeling when they first met the professor, and Peter certainly does. Kurt confesses that ever since Xavier left the team, he can't stop thinking about the day when Charles rescued him from that angry mob. Kurt now understands that Charles saved him in countless ways, particularly by teaching him that he wasn't the monster those angry people believed him to be. Kurt feels a sense of sadness about Xavier's absence. In an attempt to lift Kurt's spirits, Peter reminds him that Emma has been tirelessly using Cerebra to search for Xavier. In the Cerebra room, Emma tries to reassure Kitty that she doesn't require assistance, as she's well versed in Cerebra's inner workings. She playfully suggests that she and Lockheed could go outside to have fun with the Sentinel. Kitty, though, prefers the idea of playing with an inoperative machine, and emphasizes the importance of finding Xavier. Lockheed accidentally breathes fire on the Cerebra helmet, which irritates Emma. She asks Kitty to move the dragon away as she needs to concentrate. Kitty points out that it's Emma's own pheromones agitating Lockheed and suggests she should stop giving off them. Emma asks Kitty to wait, as she's picking up something important. She opens a map, and there's a beam headed straight for Earth. Emma explains that it's an extraordinary reading, possibly at an Omega level, but it's moving exceptionally fast. Suddenly, Emma receives an electric shock and is rendered unconscious. Kitty closely examines the viewing screen and identifies the Prospect shuttle crashing down. Kitty goes to fetch Cyclops and Beast, and together they quickly transport Emma to the medical room. Kitty is still unsure about what happened at Cerebra. It might have been an overload or something else. Hank mentions that Emma appears to be stable, but he won't be certain of the extent of her injuries until he can perform a CT scan. Despite his concern for Emma, Hank is also worried about the cause of the damage to Cerebra. Scott inquires with Kitty about the signals Emma had mentioned. Kitty is still feeling a bit dizzy from them, but informs Scott about the space shuttle re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. However, she finds it puzzling since NASA is based in Houston, and the shuttle seemed to be on a course for crashing somewhere in upstate New York. Scott swiftly assembles a team and hurries to the X-plane. Wolverine asks what the rush is, mentioning that the Maple Leafs were down 1 in the second period. Once aboard the plane, Scott explains that if Kitty is correct, the mutant Cerebra detected is coming down to Earth in a government-owned space shuttle. So, they need to reach the mutant before the government does, or they'll have to investigate while avoiding the military's attention. Logan thinks it's a risky idea, but Scott agrees, acknowledging that given recent events, he'd prefer to avoid any more problems. Rachel questions whether there's a chance it could be Professor Xavier. Scott acknowledges that there's always that possibility, and tells Rachel that he'll depend on her to detect Charles's thought patterns when they get closer. In case it isn't the professor, Scott wants to know who else could possess such incredible power. As the plane goes up, Logan reminds Scott about the Sentinel they need to deal with. Scott reassures him that they have a plan to handle it, thanks to an idea he and Hank came up with. Scott directs the plane straight toward the Sentinel, which surprises Logan as it doesn't seem typical of Scott's approach. Scott passes right by the Sentinel's face and then accelerates away at top speed. However, the Sentinel continues to chase. Scott explains that it won't be for much longer since they are nearly out of the Sentinel's visual range, and it's now tracking their heart signatures. The plane successfully exits the Sentinel's visual range, and Scott proceeds to execute the next part of his plan. He releases 5 diversion missiles, each programmed to replicate the X-Men's heart signatures accurately. These missiles spread out in various directions, traveling for 5 miles before self-destructing. Logan is genuinely impressed, and Scott explains that it's essentially a modified anti-missile defense technique adapted for a larger adversary. With the diversion in place, they now set their course for upstate. Back at the Xavier Institute, Kitty stands at the bathroom sink washing her face, and jokingly says, "Thanks to the White Queen for the headache." Suddenly, someone approaches her, causing Kitty to panic as she believes she's seeing a zombie. She lets out a scream, but a gentle hand touches her shoulder, and she starts to calm down. To her relief, it's Colossus. Kitty collects herself and tells Peter that she thought she saw something, but it must be due to residual effects from Emma's attack or something. She embraces Peter, who thinks Kitty just needs some rest and suggests taking her to her room. Kurt walks through the woods behind the school, and he notices an owl flying by, even though it's barely sunset. He finds it odd and considers it a bad omen. Kurt briefly wonders if he might be losing his mind. Setting aside his concerns, he continues his walk, but is suddenly faced by an angry mob. To his shock, he recognizes them. It's the same furious German mob that had tried to kill him years ago. They start chasing Kurt, but he disappears using his teleporting ability, confused by this strange meeting. However, the mob catches up to him and begins attacking Kurt with their torches, sticks, and stones. He feels the pain, but after a short time, the mob stops for no clear reason. Kurt is left confused, wondering what just happened. Meanwhile, the X-Men attack team approaches their destination. Logan is convinced that the military must have sent search teams by now. Rachel explains that, based on the mental scan she received from Kitty, Cerebra had calculated the impact location to be in the Adirondacks, somewhere north of Lake Placid, which is where they are now. They carefully scout the area, and Logan spots something just above the tree line. He's certain that it wasn't Professor Xavier responsible for the crash, raising questions about the situation. As everyone look out the windows, they witness a colossal arm emerging from the ground, crushing the shuttle. Rachel warns Scott that she's detecting something, but it's challenging to pinpoint. It's peculiar, but she believes there's someone inside the shuttle. Logan, concluding that they're dealing with an Omega Plus mutant, is convinced that it can't be the professor. He suggests that they need to investigate the situation. Scott guides the plane downward. Muir Island. In the once glorious Mutant Research Center, Banshee answers a video call from Beast. Sean regretfully reports that he hasn't found anything substantial yet, aside from a flood of painful memories. He even slept in his and Moira's former bed last night, and her pillow still carries the scent of her hair. Hank apologizes to Sean for subjecting him to this, but they hoped that Moira's files might provide a clue about where the professor might have gone. If anyone knew Xavier's secrets, it would have been Moira. Sean understands and expresses how much he misses Moira. Hank shares a hint of hope, mentioning that Logan and Scott may be making progress. Sean requests to stay informed, eager to leave the lab for a change. However, his attention is suddenly drawn to a female figure standing outside in the pouring rain, and she bears a striking resemblance to Moira. Alarmed, Sean rushes outside, but by the time he reaches the spot, the woman has vanished. In the Adirondack mountain hills, Logan is eager to get to the bottom of the situation. Scott had initially assumed that the rock face opening was random, but it now appears more like a tunnel of some kind. Rachel senses that something is amiss and notes that she can feel her presence faintly, but it feels off, as though she's just beyond her grasp. A female voice calls out to Scott. He believes it's Jean. Logan is unwilling to go through a situation like this again. Jean, dressed in her old Marvel Girl uniform, asks for assistance and starts fading away. Rachel dashes after her mother, and although Scott and Logan attempt to hold her back, Rachel pays no attention. Wolverine pulls out his claws, warning Scott that they're not dealing with Jean, a fact Scott is already aware of. A mysterious man, his face covered in darkness, emerges, gripping an unconscious Rachel by the throat. Cyclops and Wolverine immediately launch an attack, Muir Island. Sean is convinced that he's genuinely witnessing Moira's spirit, even though it appears to be sorrowful. He follows her to a house, but he begins to question his sanity. Upon reaching an old stockroom, Moira's spirit fades away. Sean notices important notes from Xavier, concluding that this is what Moira wanted him to discover. In the Adirondack Mountains. The X-Men's adversary sets Wolverine on fire, and he remarks that he had intended to be gentle, much like with Rachel, where he had momentarily shut down her brain. However, Scott and Logan's actions have annoyed him, prompting him to attack. He pushes them aside, but Scott quickly recovers and counterattacks with an optic blast. The man sidesteps the blast and asks Scott if he's ever wondered what his own energy beams feel like. He suggests he can arrange that and redirects the blast back towards Scott and Logan. Scott is knocked down, but Logan is starting to recover. Although Logan is determined to kill the man, it appears unlikely. The man sets Logan on fire again, rendering him unconscious once more. He returns to Rachel, noticing that she is wearing a unique Marvel Girl uniform. Scott regains consciousness and demands that the man leave Rachel alone, to which the man expresses relief that Scott hasn't changed. Scott questions how the man knows his name but faints once more. The man is surprised that Scott doesn't remember him and proceeds to drag Scott away, believing they found a use for Rachel after all. Moments later, Wolverine regains consciousness, finding himself stripped and located outdoors in the woods. A voice commands him not to move, and Logan discovers that he's surrounded by an army helicopter and a sentinel,